Today's APQ. Hi, sorry about that. Welcome to today's APQC webinar, Insights into Internal Controls. This summer, we worked with a research project on internal controls and collected data around governance, environment, automation, metrics and KPIs, and the priorities for the future in our survey. So today's webinar is going to be reviewing those findings that we had, going through the approaches to today's internal controls and regulatory requirements, technology uses to build continuous control monitoring, and review some final thoughts we have for some takeaways for the audience today. I'd like to introduce today's guest speaker, Christine Doxey. Chris, as she goes by, is an author, speaker, and management consultant that is passionate about improving financial processes and internal control programs. Chris has extensive experience with transforming and digitizing financial operations, implementing self-audit tools, and automating internal controls. She's the author of several articles and has written 4 toolkit books for Wiley F&A. And my name is Megan McCulloch. I'll be your APQC representative in today's webinar. Feel free to ask us questions in the chat feature as we go through today's webinar. And without further ado, I want to hand this over to Chris to get us started. I think Chris may be having some technical difficulties on her screen. Chris, you are muted.
Chris, it looks like you're on mute. If you could just unmute yourself.
Okay, hello. Okay, this is Chris Doxey. Sorry about that. I was muted actually twice. We broke the survey results up into different components. And the first component that we're going to talk about is internal controls governance. And what was interesting in working with the APQC about this survey and on internal controls was the different approaches that people are taking to internal controls. And basically what we're happy about sharing is the results of the increasing importance of internal controls. And what we found, and this is a great summary slide, there's a focus on cybersecurity, which makes sense, and also a focus on data privacy and also fraud risk. And again, with the change in our work environment, there's been a focus on remote work. And what we're going to do is really get into these details in a little bit more focus as we go through the slides. And it's interesting because what we found is there's certainly been a different focus on internal controls. And we'd like to start with a polling question to determine where you are, where your focus has been in 2021. We have actually a couple of polling questions for you. Okay, so we see the results and these correlate pretty much to our results of the survey, and the top focus that we're seeing with your answers to the polling question 50% focused on cybersecurity, 8% data privacy, which is a little bit different than from our results, fraud risk, 25%, and remote work, 17%. So thank you for participating in that. That kind of gives us a feel for where you are as far as what your focuses have been in 2021. All right, so we wanted to find out who is responsible for establishing and monitoring internal controls. And what we wanted to really see is how deep is an internal controls program embedded into the DNA of an organization. And what we found is that the ultimate responsibility for establishing and monitoring internal controls is the audit committee. And that's interesting because we know that the audit committee is working very closely with the board to make sure that internal controls and audit results are in line with company goals and expectations. And we see the CFO probably can be interpreted by the CFO as responsible for establishing and monitoring internal controls, which is consistent. And the next highest response was internal audit group or department. And so that is, pretty much correlating with internal audit being responsible for internal controls. And then what I'm happy to see is that many companies and many respondents have business management being responsible for internal controls. And with that shows us that business management has a responsibility for establishing and monitoring their internal controls for their respective organizations. So that's good news. 41% is a really good result. Okay, and kind of correlating with that last slide, if business management is responsible at the end of the day for internal controls, we wanted to see how well our companies ensuring that employees understand their internal control duties. And I was glad to see that 77% have formal or informal training sessions. And that's a good thing because we know that training reinforces the responsibility and the understanding. And it also is a good refresher as well. 64% have on-the-job supervision. And that's sort of, okay, let me throw the person into the internal controls responsibilities and make sure they understand what they're doing. 50% have formal or informal performance evaluations that show their responsibility and dedication to internal controls. 47% meetings, and that could be maybe in some sort of control self-assessment process, and certainly ensuring continuous monitoring. And then ensuring that internal controls are understood is actually written in job descriptions. And that's a great idea because it's sort of like, how many times have we heard over the years, particularly in a management role, that employees may say, well, it's not in my job description. And of course, those days are changing, but enforcing internal controls duties and putting that into a job description is really a good thing to do, along with these other components that we're talking about. All right, so we have our next polling question. And the polling question is, do you think that your employees understand the importance of internal controls? So this is a single choice answer with the choices being yes, no, or unsure. Yeah, so we see a percentage of 65% answering yes, 29% no, it's a little disappointing, and then 6% unsure. So maybe some of the things we're talking about today and maybe even sharing this presentation material with your employees and staff will help to ensure that understanding is improved. And I'm going to do a couple of mini case studies as we go through the material today. And I live in the Northern Virginia area, which is right outside DC. And I found myself moving to this area in 2003. because I was recruited to help WorldCom, which became MCI, get out of their troubles with fraud and actually help them build internal controls programs and got them ready for Sarbanes-Oxley 404 requirements. And one of the things we did right off the bat was we wanted to make sure that employees not only understood what they needed to do for SOX 404, of course, but also to understand what internal controls were all about. And I got to tell you, we had a lot of pushback because the employees that we were working with didn't think they needed to learn anything about internal controls. So we had a slide that showed the catalyst companies that drove Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002, and of course MCI, Bernie Evers being one of the key catalysts. So training, I can't say enough good things about. All right, so we wanted to find out about business ethics, and as you know, I found in my experience that business ethics and a tone at the top policy is going to drive the company's dedication and understanding for internal controls. The two go hand in hand. You've got to have a strong business ethics policy and foundation, as well as a dedication and support for tone at the top. And we asked if the organization has a strong policy, and I was very happy to see that 93% do. And with the 7% that don't, I mean, again, hopefully the material we're sharing with you today will help you. And if you have any questions or need any other information, we can help with that as well. And again, with ethics training being mandatory for employees, 91%, that's a great response. And for contractors, yep, 72%, and that's actually very good as well. And what we really want to do is make sure that your contractors and employees understand the requirements for business ethics and tone at the top, and having training, and having worked in the management consulting capacity for several years. I always welcome the opportunity to attend an ethics training program with any companies that I've supported. And that's to make sure that I'm up to date on what the company requires. And many companies actually have combined compliance with ethics and understanding that there's a security component of ethics as well. So that's, again, a very good results. I think, there could be a little ways to go for some respondents, but overall, good to see that there is a dedication towards business ethics. All right, third-party vendors. And here we wanted to see if the companies that the respondents supported have internal controls established to monitor business processes conducted for the organization by third-party vendors. So this could be, again, business process outsourcing. And we really want to make sure that a company that has outsourced transaction processing, examples would be accounts payable, payroll, maybe some cash application, revenue sorts of responsibilities. And, again, pretty good results here. 69% have enforced internal controls with third parties, and then 31% have, a ways to go. And what many of these companies, are doing is they're looking for reports back for the internal controls that the third party is supporting. And what helps us, and we'll get into this in the next couple of slides, is seeing metrics and seeing KPIs, key performance indicators, for what companies are doing or what third parties are doing for internal controls is a good way to measure that. All right, and next is the right to audit clause and third-party contract. And very pleased with these results, seeing that 74% answered yes. And what that means is that you can review the work that the third party is doing, and make sure that you have that right to audit clause in contracts. Now, I've worked a lot with contracts over the years, and I think it's a good rule of thumb to make sure that that's included in your contracts anyways. Okay, and we also took a look at the integration with risk and tying internal control programs to performance. And what we wanted to find out, and this is tying back to almost our theme today, that we want to see that risk management processes and internal controls are integrated. And another, mini case study for you, going back to the early days of Sarbanes-Oxley, the emphasis was on, all right, let's make sure we've got internal controls, we've got processes documented, we've got process narratives completed, and many cases we have flow charts completed. So the focus was on internal controls, and there was a great effort at documenting internal controls without really saying, all right, are we ensuring that those controls are risk-based and they're tied back to addressing a specific risk? We don't really need to have thousands of internal controls. We want to make sure we have the right ones and that they're updated properly and are addressing risk. So to a great extent, it was 33%, some extent 47%, and not at all. And this shows that there's a little bit of work to do there. And taking a look at developing risk-based internal controls is really going to help out a lot, because that way you make sure that you're focusing on the right things and that you don't have an overabundance of internal controls or key internal controls with related activities. The other key question we asked is, to what extent are the achievement of the business entity's internal control objectives linked to individual performance reviews? So 50% is to some extent, to a great extent, 23% not at all. And I've been working in the internal controls area to some capacity for a very long time. I go back to when the original COSO framework was first introduced. And what we found in some of the companies I worked for is that if we tied internal controls responsibilities to performance reviews, it really helped, again, embed the internal control dedication and responsibility to the business process areas and business process owners, and helped really establish internal controls across the board. So audits and compliance requirements weren't a surprise, because we're already doing some of those things as best practices. Okay, next we take a look at the environment for internal controls. And here's where we start taking a look at some key and primary internal controls. And we wanted to find out what is the number of key controls identified. And the top percentile is 560 key controls. Now, that's a lot, and that could hinder the amount of continuous monitoring that you do, because it's quite a few key controls. And then we wanted to break it down a little bit. So we wanted to find out, okay, we have quite a few key controls, and what percentage of those are automated? And we found 40%, with 25% being the medium. So there's some work to do with automation, and we'll see that through the rest of the slides. And then we wanted to figure out, okay, what's the percentage of key controls that are preventative? And we found that 70% said that they have, or the respondent was that 70% of the key controls are actually preventing an issue from happening. And that's very good, with the medium being 55%, because if you're able to prevent something from happening, you don't have to do a whole bunch of corrective action. You know that your internal controls are working properly. Then we wanted to figure out with our respondents, what is the percentage of key controls that are detective? And so we found 50% are detective, and 35% being the medium are detective. This means you're finding the issue after the fact. And a lot of this, could indicate transaction sampling, and maybe what we saw in our automation above, that there's some opportunity to put in some new focus on automation to build those detective controls as well. So interesting results, and very, very good to see that there is a focus on preventing something from happening. So that's a very interesting result. All right, then we wanted to, again, drill down even more, and we asked about the areas with established key primary controls. And the top respondents indicated that 55% are financial close and financial reporting. And that makes sense because we want to make sure we're closing the books properly and that we have controls built into our fiscal close as well as our financial reporting. So there's a lot of good checks and balances in that area. Next is IT, cybersecurity, and system access. And what I think is happening here is that there's a lot of focus on system access today, mostly due to segregation of duties issues. And we want to make sure that the employees that are granted system access have the ability to, number one, do their jobs properly, but we don't want to give too much system access where an employee may be able to do things like set up a supplier, pay that supplier through the payment process, and then cover their tracks with a journal voucher. And what I have seen, and this is case study number 3, I was instrumental in implementing SAP, and we had a team that were responsible for testing and validating transactions in a test environment. And when the system went into production, that access, I call it super access, was carried over. And we found one employee in accounts payable that was using her powers for evil rather than good. And she was actually setting up herself as a supplier, paying herself, and then covering her tracks, and was able to embezzle about $300,000. And we found that by doing internal control audits. And one thing we embedded into our continuous controls monitoring process was to review system access, particularly for any new systems, any upgrades. And we wanted to make sure that if a test environment was moved to production, that system access was reviewed. So that's a very key point. And seeing 51% focused on IT and cybersecurity as well as system access is a good thing. Next, highest response was the customer data, master file, customer ordering, credit collections, cash app, and accounts receivable. And we don't see a tremendous amount of fraud in accounts receivable, but it does happen. And I was glad to see that there's a focus on pretty much what this is indicating is there's a 49% focus on the key controls in the order to cash process. So very, very good to see that. Next, master files for employee master, supplier master, inventory control, and then entity level controls, 45%. So good results here, and very encouraging to see that we've got a good focus on internal controls, and we're focused on what I think are the key areas for primary controls. All right, next, as we get into more information, we wanted to figure out, okay, we've got all these great internal control programs. We know what the focus is. We know what the governance is. And we wanted to ask who is reviewing the internal controls. And we found that 69% have a dedicated group or department, and 52% rely on department staff or supervisors. 45% rely on external auditors or CPA firms, and then 41% contracted third-party audit. So what this is telling us is that some have outsourced and some rely on external areas such as, again, contracted third parties for internal controls. And In some cases, there's a dedicated group that is responsible for internal controls, usually separate from internal audit. And what this group is most likely doing is reviewing the results that the business process owners are doing. And then how often are your tests performed? And I was glad to see that 53% said on demand, and that indicates that they've probably got a high level of automation where they can pull data and look at results per transaction annually, 38%, which is pretty much what many organizations are doing semi-annually, quarterly, which is definitely a best practice, monthly, 25%. And then seeing that the internal control tests are integrated with an audit plan is a good thing as well. And we have 43% doing that. So very, again, very good results. And we're seeing a lot of, integration. We're seeing some best practices. And we are seeing that there's certainly a focus on internal controls. All right, next we get into the framework for internal controls. And not a surprise here that 50% of the respondents are utilizing the COSO, Council of Supporting Organizations of the Treadway Commission framework. Some are doing, 39% are doing COBIT, which is mostly focused on IT, and International Organizations for Standardization, ISO, 36%. And another top one is the SSAE 18 audit standard. And this is where it correlates back to our results with third parties are performing either internal control audits or they've outsourced to third parties, and a requirement for ensuring that data is kept secure and transactions are working properly is the SSAE 18 audit standard. So good to see that that's being depended upon for the most case. Okay, now we get into compliance. And what I've always believed is leveraging internal control activities with other controls such as compliance. And here we have SOX 404, and we found that there's 46% of the respondents that adhere to SOX requirements related to financial reporting. So 54% no, and these are most likely going to be private entities. And the SOX 404 is sort of a best practice for internal controls. And I've worked with many companies that aren't a public company. They don't report their results to the SEC. However, they do want to follow SOX requirements just in case they may become public one day. And it's also certainly, as mentioned, a best practice. Now, it gets interesting when we talked about the businesses reviewing internal controls for specific compliance requirements related to these requirements that we'll talk about. And we found that 62% are focused on know your customer, KYC, and KYC goes hand in hand with AML, anti-money laundering controls. So we had 60% of the respondents focused on AML. I was very glad to see that we do have a focus on the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, FCPA, actually been around since 1977. And it's hard to really focus on compliance there because we don't have a lot of data. It's a lot of manual checks and balances. We're looking for bribing foreign officials and any payments to politically exposed persons. So building a program around FCPA is difficult, and many companies do use third parties to help them with the checks and balances for that. Now, Office of Inspector General is required, or OIG is usually required or reviewed by a healthcare organization, and what they're looking for are payments to fraudsters. and specifically in the areas of fraudsters that are committing Medicare and Medicaid fraud. We want to make sure we don't have those individuals set up as customers, employees, or suppliers. Now, the surprise was the Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, focus being the lowest. And that is certainly a requirement by the Department of Treasury to make sure you're screening all the master files in your company to ensure that you're not dealing with enemies of the United States, terrorists, drug traffickers, and very important to make sure that we're doing proper screening against OFAC. Actually, that's kind of how I first got involved in compliance, is we needed to have some controls in place for OFAC screening for the supplier master. And, again, it's come a long way from when I was first involved, but there are, just to kind of close out on this slide, there are third parties that will look at compliance requirements, review your master data to make sure that you're not dealing with terrorists or money launderers or offering bribes or paying bribes to foreign officials. So interesting slide, but a bit of a surprise for the focus on OFAC. All right, next we get into automation, and I go back to the 66% that are still doing internal controls on spreadsheets, and that's how I started, again in my career, and again, it's a lot of change management. It's a lot of work to automate. I have worked with some companies to build internal controls automation, but it's getting, an understanding of what your key controls are and doing a mapping to a library of automated internal controls. It does take a fair amount of work. There are some ERP systems like Oracle and SAP and others that offer automated internal controls and risk management capabilities to go right into the transaction within the ERP and do some of the validation that's required to make sure that there's no segregation of duties issues or, certainly risk is properly managed. So, again, as this shows, we have a ways to go with our automation, as we know. 48% document retrieval and storage application. So the manual spreadsheets and document retrieval and storage application kind of go hand in hand. The biggest challenge, as many of you know, with manual spreadsheets is that what happens, you've got to figure out, okay, who has the latest and greatest spreadsheet? What's the latest version? And, I go back to the days of FileNet and Documentum to keep track of what's the latest internal control program or internal control requirement, and what are the latest testing results. Because guess what? You're going to need to go back and look at that to make sure that everything has been properly documented and any issues have been remediated. Many companies have done internally developed programs. So, it's a bit of automation. Many use a hybrid, and, again, having some sort of a program for internal controls is key. And, again, we know there are challenges with manual and spreadsheet. Then we have the ERM applications that I was mentioning, GRC software, and then a module that's being used within their ERP system that we talked about as well, and then process mapping software. So, ways to go here, but we're showing a lot of good progress with using some of the tools that are available to us. All right, advanced automation for controls. And we wanted to see that organizations have considered additional controls of advanced automation tools such as AI and or RPA for internal controls. So 25%, great extent, 34% to some extent, or not at all, 41%. And then we asked about the maturity level for internal controls. Traditional static annual audit plan, 41%, somewhere in the middle, 40%, and then dynamic audit plan based on continuous auditing results, which is 20%. And then we wanted to find out about the extent able to leverage automation tools to test complete data sets. To some extent, 52%, good to see that. Great extent, 20%, not at all, 28%. And, again, this makes sense, tied back to our survey results saying that we have a ways to go with looking at automation. And this is an interesting slide because we're looking at how are organizations enhancing monitoring. And what we're seeing is that we look at not considering there some experimentation, there's some piloting going on, there's a rollout going on, and then there's a fully implementation happening. And, again, if we look at continuous auditing, that's being, heading in the right direction as far as being fully implemented. Continuous monitoring, 23%. And those are the top ones. We are seeing, some positivity with cloud computing and advanced analytics. And, again, with internal controls, it's important to understand that it's not just reporting results and doing correction, but it's taking a look at how can analytics be put in place and how can you continue to do some integration with other processes as well. All right, then we wanted to figure out, okay, what's happening in the world of metrics that are being tracked. And, I mentioned that we did take a look at metrics and KPIs. And one of the top ones is the percentage of transactions tested in a given time period, 49%, a little bit on the low side, but not horrible. Number of reports produced by type, 46%, and then number of internal controls tested in a given time period, so 42%. Now, again, we can drill back into the data and figure out what that time period was, but what we want to do is focus on, key controls, and we want to focus on the biggest area of risks. And that's why looking at integrating internal controls with risk management is a key area. The next one I'll just mention quickly is the average number of hours by forensics, quality, IT, or internal audit spent on internal controls, and that's 40% of those hours. Now we get into, all right, we're doing some measurement, but what are some of the KPIs? And these are the top ones that we found. Number of financial reporting, accounting, control violations in the past 12 months. So here are the medians 10, and the highest is 15, the lowest is of course 4. And what we're seeing is there's been some violations, and which isn't necessarily a bad thing. The issue is, are you correcting and updating your business process as well as your internal controls for that process in a timely manner? And that you might be finding a control area such as a payment to a phony vendor or a duplicate payment. If you're finding it and you're correcting it, then that is showing that your internal control program is working. And the next one got, again, a little bit interesting. We're looking at the average cycle time and days from the idea of change and risk until the changes to risk policies are completed. And, again, the low is 30 days, 55 days is the medium, and 88 days. This is a little bit too long because, as mentioned in my prior statement, is we want to make sure that we're correcting and updating policies and processes in a timely manner if we are finding a control violation. And then average cycle time and days from the ID of a control violation until the violation is reported. 11, a little bit on the high side, 3 is good, 6 isn't too bad, And then the last one was the average cycle time in days from reporting of a violation until investigation completed. Now, this wasn't again, a horribly negative result, but 30% is not a bad cycle time. 60%, of course, is very good, and 7% is great. All right, so in looking at one of our last section, we wanted to find out, all right, what are your priorities for internal controls? And, again, if you had a crystal ball, if you had a unlimited amount of resources, budget and personnel, where would you be focusing? So cybersecurity being the highest, 80%, automation, glad to see that at 73%, business process ownership, 61%, and then the next highest one is continuous monitoring at 57%. So, again, it's sort of like cybersecurity is in the news. We know we have issues. There's been a lot of data breaches, and focusing on that. And I think really tying automation and cybersecurity together is certainly a best practice. All right, we have our next polling question. What are your top priorities for your internal controls program? And we're just trying to get a feel on what the attendees of today's webinar are focused on. All right, so we're seeing 38% cybersecurity, correlates back to our results, 23% automation, and then business process ownership, 31 and 8% other. So thank you very much for answering that question. And if we move on with our content, we wanted to just bring up the regulatory compliance requirements. And this is just my plug, if you will, for OFAC. And, again, we're surprised that the compliance with OFAC was somewhat low. And just to quote the US Treasury, the US persons must comply with OFAC regulations. This includes US citizens, permanent resident, aliens, regardless of where they're located, all persons and entities within the US and US incorporated entities in their foreign branches should be complying with OFAC regulations. I just wanted to make a plug for that. And then we wanted to talk a little bit about continuous monitoring, because that's something we're certainly seeing that automation can support. And I talked about user access controls, focusing on monitoring and remediation. And honestly, if you were to ask me what's the biggest challenge with internal controls, I would say remediation is probably one of the top issues. You can do all the testing and documenting and monitoring, but if you're not correcting and you're not remediating, it sort of defeats the purpose. So CCM also focuses on business transaction monitoring, and we talked quite a bit about the master data, and also looking at static data controls monitoring. And then we also want to make sure, and this goes back to my mini case study about testing and moving an application into production. Now, a lot of this, of course, is done in the cloud. However, it doesn't mean that the controls that we need for application and configuration doesn't need to be addressed. So those are the 4 pillars or 4 components of CCM that are certainly best practices and should be considered for your internal control program. So as far as my final thoughts, and this goes back to the results that we reviewed, and again, looking at financial close and financial reporting, I'm very happy to see that there's a focus there, because many organizations are so focused on closing the books and getting through the components of the financial close, which is transaction accumulation and general ledger and close and consolidation. the third component is the final mile or the financial report, that it's sometimes difficult to really focus on the internal controls because everyone is in such a rush to get through the financial close. I was glad to see that. And I was also glad to see that there's a pretty good percentage of transaction tested in a given time period. That's not bad. It could be a little higher as a best practice, but certainly not bad. And then, again, we do see that there's a lot of room for automation because we're still using spreadsheets. And, again, many organizations, as mentioned, are moving towards a hybrid model. But I think that we've got a ways to go with spreadsheets. As long as we're controlling and we're monitoring the latest and greatest spreadsheet, and we have controls around who has access to spreadsheets, it's not a bad thing, but there are some ways to go towards automation. All right, so the priorities correlate to what our polling question showed, as well as again, what we found in the survey. Cybersecurity being the highest, automation 73%, and then business process ownership at 70 or 61%. All right, so we have time for your questions. So feel free to ask me whatever is something you'd like to get more information on.
Chris, we've got a question in our chat. Matthew is asking, is there a good resource for making the case for automation, and there may be a cost associated to it?
Yeah, I mean, it depends, again, on where you are, with, your current environment. So it's understanding what your risk is with, using spreadsheets, or if you're in a totally manual process. So it's developing a business case, and the cost would really be driven by whether you use what your ERP system offers, such as Oracle and SAP, as mentioned, and there are others. And if you are in a position where you'd need to purchase third-party software. What I've seen, because I've worked with some of the ERP implementations, it's very quick, and the results are almost immediate. So the ROI, again, for automation can be pretty compelling, because if you want to look at, all right, how many control, really looking at, okay, what's the cost of my process today? How many resources am I using? Am I focused on embedding internal control requirements into the business, which automation supports? So you look at the cost, the risk, and what your cost of non-automation is, how many control issues you're finding. And I think you would see that putting together your business case would be the way to go. And I actually have a template that I can provide to the APQC for you that helps you get a business case together. And what we can do from there is share that with the attendees of today's webinar, and it will give you an idea. So that's something I can gladly do today.
Wonderful. And to follow up with that, we have another question around automation. Are there any frameworks to help select controls for automation?
Yeah. And what I usually do is I do a mapping with key controls, and it's interesting. You don't do the automation, of course, in a vacuum. You work with the organization to prioritize their controls that they'd like to see automated, and that's usually done by again, a lot of meetings, and then mapping, and again, to the library of existing internal controls in the automated tool. And again, I go back to Paisley Risk Navigator, where one size doesn't fit all. And you may find out that there needs to be a tool, or in addition to the tool for one of your key controls. There are some controls that cannot be automated. I found in the oil and gas industry, if there's a lot of peripheral controls, third-party controls that you don't have automated access to, those are going to need to be on spreadsheets, and you'll end up with a hybrid. But again, there's a template that I can also provide that shows you where to take a look and where to focus and where to prioritize. And the obvious statement is any controls or any business areas that you've had problems in would be the ones that you prioritize. And I can tell you off the bat, the areas that I've seen the biggest problems start with, which is why I'm happy to see so much focus on finance reporting. That's one of the top focuses. The second focus is payment. And the third focus is system access or segregation of duties. So those are the three top focuses. And, again, I can put together a little toolkit along with the business case template for everybody that is attending today.
Wonderful. Another question, what are the best practices to align internal control assessment and testing plans with the internal audit?
Yeah, again, this is probably case study number 4 for me, that, I can share my experience with you. Back when I was first starting, I guess, my internal controls journey, we wanted to figure out, okay, we can write our own programs, right? Or you can see what internal audit's doing. So what I did, kind of being, a little progressive, I said, okay, I worked with internal audit and I said, show me your audit programs, for inventory control. I was in logistics at the time. I said, as a controller in logistics, I said, let me see what you're doing for inventory control, what you're doing for, shipment, for receiving. And so we used what internal control had for programs, or internal audit had for programs, as a base. And then we figured out the ones that were the most important for us. And they were doing, we actually implemented a program to improve our cycle counting, again, in the logistics area, and become physical inventory exempt, which was huge. So we integrating with internal audit is to, number one, see if they'll share their audit programs with you. And the next thing to do is to see if they will share their internal audit plans with you. Usually they call it the internal controls universe, where they're going to focus. And I think establishing that teamwork, again, there has to be a level of independence with internal audit and the rest of the company. But what I did, going back to one of my little mini case studies at MCI, WorldCom, to build Sarbanes-Oxley requirements and really focus on the key controls, I established a strong teamwork with internal audit and was able to figure out where to focus and where to prioritize, because you can't do it all. You have to break it up into a project plan. So very good question.
Okay, the next one, asking if you know what the features are in SAP that they could use to audit their internal controls.
Yeah, I mean, I know some older functionality, and it used to be called managing internal controls. And within the ERP, it's going to tie back to your transactions, and it's implemented, certainly by module, if you will. And I'm, a little bit more familiar with Oracle, but I know SAP's functionality is very, very similar, and everything is tied back to transaction, and it's focused on key areas to look at by module, where you want to focus. And that's certainly something I can do a little bit of research on as well.
Thank you. And our next question, does process mining exercise help in internal control gaps identification?
Could you repeat the question?
Sure. Does process mining exercise help in internal control gaps identification?
Yeah, if you're talking about data mining and data analytics, it certainly does. And I found if organizations are just doing controls and they're not delving into their transactions and doing some of the key analytics and metrics, some of which we talked about, and even going a little bit deeper, if you're wanting to look at metrics for some of the key process areas like record to report or to cash, procure to pay, there are certain key metrics to look at that will show you if there's going to be a risk, and those need to be tied to analytics and data mining as well. But again, with some of the automation we're talking about, that will help you with data mining, and it will certainly look at some of the key areas. And statistically, you want to look at analytics to identify process anomalies, and those are going to be driven by the type of process that you're focused on. So, for instance, if you're looking at payment, you want to make sure that you're paying certain vendors more than one time. I mean, so there's a whole bunch of fraud reviews and analytics you can do as well. So that's a good question.
And we've got time for one more. What single action can a person take to make my internal control program more effective?
Yeah, I think the single action is to make it visible. And I say this about really any process is make it visible, report metrics, and work with establish a stakeholder, whether it's your controller, your CFO, and look at reporting results. And you don't want to throw people under the bus, of course, but I think making things visible and also adding that accountability factor that we talked about quite a bit, and that is ensuring that internal controls are tied to business results and personal performance. So I would do, it's probably two things, but increase the visibility and also see what you can do about holding the accountability as a key factor for being responsible for internal control results.
Thank you, Chris. We really appreciate you reporting out on the survey results and the studies that we've been doing. So here with your slide deck that you'll be getting in the next 48 hours, we've got some additional resources related to this topic, including the internal controls collection. To let you know, we are still analyzing all of our data and creating great content for you. So that first collection is going to continue growing over the next several months. So continue checking for new content coming out of our most recent study. And then we have a collection on evolving practices in the enterprise risk management, and then the risk and finance function collection. And then a reminder that you'll be receiving a copy of the slides and the recording from today within 2 business days. And as soon as the webinar closes, please make sure to take the satisfaction survey. We love to hear your feedback. And of course, go to www.apqc.org/events to learn more about the upcoming webinars and events that APQC has. Thank you so much.